And welcome to this edition of Art Beat. Tonight we'll be visiting Pineville sculptor George Trivellini, and then Joan Lindley, and we'll travel to her studio in Frenchtown. I spent a pleasant summer day in the presence of a gentle, gracious metalworker, George Trivellini, from Pineville, Pennsylvania. We conversed as we fed the geese near his pond and admired some of his stainless steel sculptures which we'd placed outside on his lovely grounds. His sculptures fit well in the landscape of Bucks County, yet one can easily imagine them in a museum, a sculpture garden, or outside in a city setting. Montana-born George is a painter-turned-sculptor who attended the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts and Pratt Institute. He has devoted his life to fine arts and has exhibited extensively in New York, Philadelphia, Chicago, Cleveland, and Princeton. He is represented in private collections all over the world.
Normally, you determine what type of steel you would like, whether it be stainless steel, carbon steel, whatever. And from there, you cut it to size. And it can be cut in different ways. With the torch, one way. And after the torch work is finished, then of course you start with your welding. And the welding would entail most of it at one point, and the rest of it will follow up as you go along. For a number of reasons, it's better to do it that way than try and do it all at one time. And then after the welding is through, then of course it's the cleaning up with the grinders. And you must do it all well so that it doesn't, no slag remains. And from there on, you can take it on a step farther to the finishing part of it, which again is with grinders and polishing. I was inspired by a trip to Europe on the Riviera. And it seemed to me that it might lend itself to an interesting sculpture. And I liked the water, enjoyed the design that the water makes, the waves, and it just seemed like it would be an ideal thing to do. It started out as a much smaller piece, but it kept getting larger all the time. It was a fun thing to do. I felt that it needed something that retained the look of water, you know, the glistening of the water. And on the wave itself, that's silver leaf on it, actual silver leaf, which again gives it an interesting burnished look to it. I was in so many machine shops where they have so much of these things that are thrown out. These are called punch-outs. They're made under enormous amount of pressure, and it punches them right out of solid steel. And I saw so many of these on the floor and just being thrown out as scrap, and I thought, I must be able to do something with them. So I experimented with them, and it seemed to warrant doing a sculpture. They're all fitted, even though they look as if they're just thrown on there, but they're fitted together and they're cut and shaped and welded, you know, to make a design. And somehow or another, it seemed like it needed more than just steel flowing down. So I thought that I'd like to put something with a little more organic feeling to it. Consequently, I put the outer shell of steel. And also, later on, I added a patina, which I made up here in my studio. And I got a 50-gallon drum, and I put the material in the drum and heated it. And then I dipped the thing in. It gives this unusual effect. I wanted to do an abstract piece in all stainless. I just felt that the interplay of the different elements would be something quite interesting. And with stainless steel, it's a very difficult medium to work with because it's so hard. But once you attain a patina of a sort, it remains permanent. I just felt I'd like to do something that would bring those qualities out, which is something unique with metal. There's no other metal that will give you that quality. And also I wanted to keep the elements rather small so that they would have a better interplay with one another. It's incredible how it changes its form. For instance, if it's outside, the movement of the sun is completely different. The piece is completely different from 1 hour to the next. And this is something I get a thrill out of. This particular piece started out as a very small piece of sculpture. I hadn't planned to do a large one, but the more I looked at it, the more I felt that it had the possibilities of a good sculpture. But before going into a stainless steel piece, I felt that I'd rather try it with wood so that I would be able to, you know, determine what problems I would be faced with in the steel, and also give me a better feeling for the size. And it seemed that the prototype in wood would be the answer to it. And I'm not sorry that I made it, because it has answered these questions for me. And I propose to make it a bit larger than the present prototype. In our space was several years in the talking stage, but finally we arrived at that we needed a sculpture. And it seemed to be that with all the problems that the steel people were having at the time, that we wanted something that would help the situation. And it occurred to me that inner space would be the way to go. We're talking about the inner problems that they're having, as well as the outer problems. And they seemed to like that idea. And then it meant getting a prototype together, because many people had to review this before I went into the final piece. And that, of course, took quite a bit of time, the concept of it, and getting a small prototype was quite a chore. But eventually everything was set to go and do the finish on it, and it was done with all stainless steel rods. The problem occurred when we found that this is a compound curve that we started with. It started, in other words, from one side and wound up around the other side, which meant that every single rod that was put on was a different size. but it had to be within a certain length, each one of them, so that they made a complete circle around without any gaps or breaks in any way. So this took quite a bit of doing, but you know, eventually with help and all, it was completed. Art has been my life right from the beginning. I've never done anything but art, never had any other job. And it's really not what I consider a job. To me, it's just enjoyment, the pleasure of doing things, doing something which is like one of a kind. You know, you never see another one like it, good or bad. But to me, it's something that I look forward to every day, and look forward to the challenge of doing something better all the time.
Solstice, this magnificent stainless steel sculpture, is a permanent installation at the Denman Davis Steel Company in Clifton, New Jersey.
The primary reason that the sculpture came about is they were ready to celebrate their 100th anniversary in the steel business, which of course is very unusual. And Dave, who's head of the company, asked me if I felt that I could do something for that anniversary. And of course I was delighted to try. And I started out with a small, very small prototype. I didn't know what direction they would feel like going, or whether I would be going in the direction that I would want. In any case, after the first prototype, which seemed to be in agreement with everyone, I went on to a larger one. And as a matter of fact, I went into several larger ones before we arrived at the present one. And of course, this turned out to be a much larger project than we had anticipated, because as we went along, we felt that perhaps we could make a sculpture park out of it, which entailed a design for a fence, which was made up in Corten steel and was cut right there at the plant, which was another asset, being able to do it right there. One of my weaknesses is the sun. I've enjoyed working designs around the sun. I think the sun is everything. Without the sun, of course, it's nothing. And I felt that a kinetic look to it would enhance the sun, and to have it turn was just, was the answer to it. At the company to do it, I just felt I'd just take advantage of it. And everyone seemed to be quite pleased with it. And I'm especially pleased with it because as it turns, it's very slow motion. And as it turns, it just blends into itself.
Solstice was fabricated at Denman Davis in Clifton, where a giant magnet can lift 15,000 pounds, and the huge cranes manage 30,000 pounds of steel effortlessly. Here too, these huge beams of steel are cut like butter with the power of 6 torches. The sparks flew in firework cascades at our feet as we watched the cut lengthen in the steel. Mr. Trivellini does as much preparation at his Pineville studio as he can. Solstice was carried back and forth between Pineville and Clifton at different stages of development. The motorization of Solstice was worked on at the plant because of the size and weight of the finished sculpture. It does seem incongruent that such a thing of beauty is partially created in an industrial setting. George Trivellini is a gentle giant whose strong, firm handshake quickly awakens one to the power he commands, both as an artist and a man. His warm smile and soft twinkling eyes are reflected in his work. He transforms cold, hard steel into sculpture which possesses a warm, lyrical quality. One man's fascination with the sun and his artistic skill have enabled all who see his sculpture to pause and reflect. Solstice has already become a landmark in Clifton, New Jersey. It's easy to see why. I recently visited Joan Lindley from Irwina, Pennsylvania, at a showing of her work at the Four Corners Gallery in Lambertville, New Jersey. Her abstract canvases clearly show an evolution in style, which is quite distant from her early classical training. She says that her work shows a searching for self, which is constantly changing. Joan is working on a new canvas here at her studio in Frenchtown. Her studio is garret-like. It's hidden away and yet lies exposed to the sky via a huge window. There is a genuine Greenwich Village quality about the space which fits in comfortably in this artistic community. Joan, when you approach a new work, the canvas that you're working on, for instance, here in your studio, what goes on in your mind? I mean, how do you just get a piece of fresh canvas, put it up on the easel, and then what happens?
Well, let's see, in this piece, actually I've just come away from an exhibition, so I've spent a great deal of time putting together work for an exhibition. And in the past few months, I have spent a great deal of time out of the studio. So I have a lot of energy and a lot of drive that has just been turned toward doing the daily things for an exhibition. And I had an idea for a canvas, and I had stretched the canvas and put it in the studio, so I do spend time looking just at the canvas. But when I found I had some free time, I could hardly wait to get into all the colors that I have in my palette and get into the actual working on the canvas. I really had a concept of color and shapes moving from the left side of the canvas across the canvas into a white field. What you saw today is the way the canvas is progressing. I've just begun it, so it's just
Just that little splash of yellow.
Yes, that is also has been left there in the paintings moving along. What fascinates me sometimes is that my work has become so organic that sometimes I move all the way from black through to white without realizing that it was the white that I was headed toward. In this canvas at this point, I'm trying very hard to keep my darker palette, although I am moving toward the white in a certain way.
Do you always use a sketch to begin?
Not always, but I do sketch. I have small sketchbooks here that I do small sketches, yes, for ideas of canvases. I do quite often sketch.
Now, how long might a canvas like this take to complete?
Probably 2 to 3 months. If it is a canvas that I find difficult to resolve, I will begin another piece of work, either a monoprint or something of a smaller scale, and then go back and forth between the two.
I noticed when we were in Lambertville at your show that you try different mediums. At least at that show there were many different mediums exhibited. Would you talk about that mounted fish? That was an interesting piece.
The mounted fish began with a friend of mine gave me some cigar boxes, and it was really in a much more playful mood, in a much less serious, I'm going to make a painting mood. I began wrapping the fish with acetate, and then I found that drawing on acetate is a wonderful surface, and I also found that using a pen and ink on acetate is wonderful, and I found that you could sew through acetate. So I really sort of took off, and the fish evolved from a self-portrait to a sewn-on shape to a fish shape. And then I decided I wanted something not dissimilar to, again, it was with a certain amount of tongue-in-cheek, to what I had seen on people's walls over my lifetime, which was the mounted deer or the mounted fish or whatever. So that's how that evolved.
In your afternoon idol in the gallery, I noticed that there was writing in the canvas. Tell us about that.
I never used to write in my work. I always felt that I was a painter, and it was through my painting that I was going to be able to express myself. I have found the gesture of writing, the scratching into the surface of paint, very exhilarating for me. I like to get a surface of paint, turn a brush around and use the end tip and scratch through the surface of paint to whatever is beneath it. I've also been very hesitant to have my writing too clear, to become too much of a part of the work of itself, so that I almost always will write and then paint over or obliterate part of it. But the writing is becoming more important to me, and the sense of the words have become more important to me and are appearing more and more in my work.
And this is a recent development.
Yes, I have been scratching into my work for years, but the writing is becoming, yes, more recent.
But then why the writing on your studio wall?
Those are really pieces that are very important to me. I've been reading a lot about the Northwest Coast Indian and the Hopi Indian and the Indians of New Guinea, and I'm very interested in masks and rituals and their seasonal mystery plays. And they're things that when I've come upon them in my reading, I realize they relate very much to what I'm doing at my age in my studio in the United States. So I have written on the wall a lot of the thought that comes from possibly the Indian that I identify with. Certainly their concept of continuum rather than linear thought is one I find really delicious.
Which piece in your recent show do you feel most shows this trend, this circular kind of ideas? And
that's difficult. I think in some sense the large oils are closer than the works on paper. One of them really is called Celebrating Rituals. I am a colorist, and I think my desire to pull the color from the piece rather than to work as I always have with the color, for me was more the concept of Celebrating Rituals was more the idea and less the painterly approach, my former painterly approach, and much more of a cerebral, trying to have a cerebral concept. That's one of the closest. I mean, that one certainly was one I was thinking of.
I like looking at these two that are related, the three figures, and then this one is what you call a monoprint. Would you talk to us about their relationship?
A number of years ago, I saw a review in the New York Times of an exhibition of the Graham Gallery. The artist was doing monoprints. But what he was doing was he was using ink on a board. He painted the board with the image he wanted. Then he took Japanese rice paper and he moistened the rice paper and he put it down on top of the image and he rubbed the back of the paper and he pulled up his image. Well, the reproduction was so beautiful, and I had never tried a monoprint, but I did. I bought myself some Japanese paper, I bought ink, and I started. And I've gone from working on wood to using a piece of plexiglass as my plate for my work. So the three figures that is called Untitled, the one that is really a monoprint, was done on a piece of plexiglass with printer's ink. And then when I saw the plexiglass, after I had printed it and turned it around, I was so interested in the reverse side of the plexiglass that I had that mounted on something and then proceeded to paint on the back side of the plexiglass. And doing that, I used gouache and painted further, so it's really a piece behind a piece and a piece on top of a piece. So it's really three.
Art is your profession, and it's always been a big part of your life. And I just wondered where you see your life going as an artist.
I hope richer, fuller. As I have worked in the studio for the past 7 or 8 years, each successive year has been a better one for my work. I think the times are wonderful for working. I find support for my work. I'm beginning to have interest in my work. I'm beginning also to make contact with friends that I knew years and years ago when I was very young and working, who are still working, and we're extremely pleased to reinitiate our friendships. I'm full of a lot of very good feelings about my work. I think that for a painter, if you can stay healthy, if you keep your eyesight, you can do nothing almost but get better, because all that you have just feeds into it all the time. So I'm very, very, very excited now about my life and my work.
I know how difficult it is to be a wife and a mother and have a profession too, but you continued to paint as you raised your children and assumed these roles?
Yes. Yes and no. I did, but I did it in a very laid-back way. I did have a studio on the farm, and I did continue to work in the studio, and I did continue to exhibit my work, but at a much lower key. Then after a period of maybe about 10 years, it was almost not at all. But I never stopped, but it was very, very low key. It's strange what the mind does. I always thought I was intensely involved, but I really wasn't. I had sort of pulled away. But I'm very grateful for those years, actually.
In speaking with many artists, I often ask them where their ideas come from what inspirations. Do you use travel? Do you cut out things from magazines, and do you suddenly get ideas driving along? Or, I mean, do you find that you are absorbing things constantly like a sponge, and it's almost overkill sometimes?
I think it's almost everything now. I don't go out and work from landscapes. I used to do that. I'm really pulling a lot out of myself. I spend my time within the studio. And I must say, for the first time in my life, I'm becoming really committed to reading about another culture, and I'm getting a lot of food from that. I also, as I can break molds for myself, as I can become less restrictive, I find I'm very excited about all media now. It's as if I'm beginning to allow myself to really feel that I could put together a piece of tin or a video or whatever to make it work if it needed that. So it's almost as if the culture is giving us a license to try, and I'm beginning to give myself a license to try.